Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you this evening. This has been my first visit to Columbia University, and I've really enjoyed your beautiful campus as well as getting to know many of you. I especially enjoyed the dialogue last night with Shelley Kagan, and I'm looking forward to our discussion together this evening. 20 centuries after his death, Jesus of Nazareth continues to fascinate thinking men and women. From the Da Vinci Code to the Passion of the Christ to the Talpiot tomb, Jesus continues to capture the public's imagination. For centuries, Jesus has been the most influential person in human history, and he refuses to go away. But who was Jesus of Nazareth really? Was he God incarnate, as Christians believe? Or could the historical Jesus, as many Jewish people believe, have been simply a Jewish holy man? Or are Muslims correct in thinking him to have been no more than a human prophet sent by God? Or could certain radical contemporary critics be correct that Jesus was a sort of social gadfly, the Jewish equivalent of a Greek cynic philosopher? Well, perhaps the best way to get a start at these questions is to ask what Jesus thought about himself. If you want to know who someone is, then the logical place to begin is to ask him who he thinks himself to be. Who did Jesus think that he was? Well, immediately we confront a problem. Since Jesus himself did not leave behind any writings of his own, we're dependent upon the works of others for knowing what Jesus said and did. Now, this situation isn't unusual for figures of antiquity. For example, the famous Greek philosopher Socrates also left behind no writings of his own. We're dependent upon his disciple Plato for most of our knowledge of Socrates' life and teaching. In the same way, we're dependent upon the records of Jesus' followers for our knowledge of his life and teaching. But while this situation isn't unusual, it does occasion the question, how do we know that these records are accurate? Maybe Jesus' followers claimed that he said and did certain things that he really didn't. In particular, since the early Christians believed that Jesus was God, maybe sayings and stories to that effect evolved in the Christian church and were ascribed to the historical Jesus. So we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus in the Gospels makes claims and does things implying his divinity. Maybe the historical Jesus who really lived was quite different from the divine figure that we read about in the Gospels. How can we tell if these records are historically accurate? Well, up until the modern era, questions of this sort were basically unanswerable. But with the rise during the Renaissance of the modern science of historiography and of textual criticism, historical scholars began to develop the tools to unlock these questions. Jesus is today no longer just a stained glass figure in a window, but a real flesh and blood person of history, just like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, whose life can be investigated using the standard methods of history. The writings contained in the New Testament can be scrutinized using the same historical criteria that are used in investigating other sources of ancient history, like Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars or the Annals of Tacitus. Now, the first thing that we need to do in conducting a historical investigation of Jesus is to assemble our sources. Jesus of Nazareth is referred to in a range of ancient sources, both inside and outside the New Testament, including Christian, Roman, and Greek, or rather Jewish sources. Now, this is really quite extraordinary when you think about how obscure a figure Jesus of Nazareth was. He had at most a 3-year public life as an itinerant Galilean preacher. And yet we have far more information about Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most major figures of antiquity. The most important of these historical sources have been collected into the New Testament. References to Jesus outside the New Testament tend to confirm what the Gospels say about him, but they really don't tell us anything new. And therefore, the focus of our investigation must be upon the documents contained in the New Testament. Now, I find that many students don't understand this procedure. They think that if you examine the New Testament writings themselves, rather than look at sources outside the New Testament, then somehow you're reasoning in a circle, using the Bible to prove the Bible. If you even quote a passage out of the New Testament, they think that somehow you're begging the question, presupposing that the New Testament is reliable. But that's not at all what historians do when they examine the New Testament documents. They're not treating the Bible as some sort of holy, inspired book and then trying to prove it's true by quoting it. Rather, they're treating the New Testament just like any other collection of ancient documents and investigating whether they're reliable. It's important to understand in this connection that originally there wasn't any such book called the New Testament. There were just these separate documents handed down out of the first century, things like the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John, the Acts of the Apostles, Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, Greece, and so forth. It wasn't until a couple of centuries later that the church assembled these documents under one cover, which then came to be known as the New Testament. The church only included the earliest sources which were closest to Jesus and the apostles, and they left out the later secondary accounts like the forged apocryphal gospels, which everybody knew were fakes. So from the very nature of the case, the best historical sources were included in the New Testament. People who insist on investigating only evidence taken from writings outside the New Testament don't understand what they're asking us to do. They're asking us to ignore the earliest primary sources about Jesus in favor of sources that are later, secondary, and less reliable, which is just mad as historical methodology. Now, this is important because all of the radical reconstructions of the historical Jesus that you hear about are based on later writings outside the New Testament. In particular, the so-called Apocryphal Gospels. What are the Apocryphal Gospels? Well, these are Gospels which were forged under the apostles' names. Things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so on and so forth. They first began to appear in the second half of the 2nd century after Christ. And radicals claim that these extra biblical writings are the key to correctly reconstructing the historical Jesus. Professor Luke Johnson, who is a distinguished New Testament scholar at Emory University, points out that all of the recent spate of books claiming to uncover the real Jesus follow the same predictable pattern. It goes like this. 1. The book begins by trumpeting the scholarly credentials of the author and his prodigious research. 2. The author claims to offer some new and maybe even suppressed interpretation of who Jesus really was. 3. The truth about Jesus is said to be discovered by means of sources outside the New Testament, which enable us to read the Gospels in a new way which is at odds with their face value meaning. 4. This new interpretation is provocative and maybe even titillating. For example, that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, or was the leader of a hallucinogenic cult, or was a Jewish cynic philosopher. And 5, it is implied that traditional Christian beliefs are therefore undermined and need to be revised. Now, if you hear of books following this familiar 5-point pattern, then your critical antennae should immediately go up. You are about to be duped. For the fact is that there is no document outside the New Testament which calls into question the portrait of Jesus painted in the Gospels. In the words of John Meyer, who is a prominent New Testament critic, the idea that the Apocryphal Gospels offer us new information about Jesus is, and I quote, largely fantasy, end quote. The fact is that these writings are later derivative writings shaped by the theology of the 2nd century or even later, and that what this means, in the words of Professor Johnson, is that despite all of the hoopla in the media, the writings of the New Testament remain our best historical witnesses to the life of Jesus. So, try not to think of the New Testament as a single book. Imagine that it was never assembled. Try to think of it as what it originally was, just a bunch of separate documents written in the Greek language, handed down out of the 1st century, telling this remarkable story about Jesus of Nazareth. And the question is, how historically reliable are these documents? Here we confront the very crucial question of the burden of proof. Should we assume that the Gospels are reliable unless they are proven to be unreliable? Or should we assume that the Gospels are unreliable until they are proven to be reliable on some point? Are they innocent until proven guilty, or are they guilty until proven innocent? Skeptical scholars almost always assume that the Gospels are guilty until proven innocent. That is to say, they assume that the Gospel narratives are unreliable unless and until they can be proven to be reliable on some particular fact. And I'm not exaggerating here. This really is the approach of skeptical critics. I want to suggest, however, 5 reasons why I think it would be historically unjustified to simply assume that the Gospels are unreliable until proven to be correct. Number 1, there was insufficient time for legendary influences to expunge the hard core of historical facts. Sometimes students will say, well, how can you know anything that happened 2,000 years ago? What they fail to understand is that the crucial time gap is not the gap between the evidence and today. Rather, what is important is the gap between the evidence and the events that the evidence is about. If the gap between the events and the evidence about them is short, then it doesn't matter how much both the events and the evidence have receded into the past. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the passage of time. As long as the time gap between the events and the evidence about them is short, then it's just irrelevant how long it has been since the time of the events until the present day. So the question here then is how close the sources for Jesus' life are to the time he lived. And here the Gospels are in marked contrast to the sources for Greek and Roman ancient history. The sources for Greek and Roman history are usually biased and usually removed 1 or 2 generations or even centuries from the events that they record. And yet Greco-Roman historians reconstruct with confidence the course of Greek and Roman history. By contrast, the Gospels were all written down and circulated within the first generation after the events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive. According to Professor A.N. Sherwin-White, a professional Greco-Roman historian, in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament,